There's also what happened this week, as just within hours of the Lebanon-Israel, uh, you know, uneven ceasefire, um, we saw something emerge in the situation emerge in Syria. And it's been very interesting to see how that's been explained or described by both Western corporate media and regional media as well. And Ali, I know you wanted to kind of take us back, 10 years to quickly, lay out the context for what we're seeing now in Syria and why it's important to keep an eye on how it's being reported, who stands to benefit, Israel's role in all of this, of course, the US's role in all of this, and what comes next for the region.
Right. Well, let's start with where we are now. And of course, what is happening in Syria is a continuation of the long civil war there, the dirty war that was put on hold for a couple of years. And people get very, this can be a controversial topic because people think that when you talk about Syria, it's a litmus test on whether you love or hate the government of Syria or love or hate the president of Syria. And that's not the case at all, because you can rightly criticize all of the Arab regimes without exception, including, of course, the ones that are closest to Israel and the United States, for being completely undemocratic and dictatorial. Um, and just as you could Saddam Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, and opposition to US intervention in Iraq was not the same thing as cheerleading for Saddam Hussein. So I just want to say that at the outset so people don't try to misrepresent our discussion of the facts and the interests which are going on. But let's start from where we are now, Nora, which is the comments of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Again, this is him speaking at the NATO press conference earlier today, responding to a question about Syria.
I think what we've just seen in Syria with the offensive by HTS reflects the fact that Assad's key backers, key allies, whether it's Russia, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Iran, have all, in different ways, been distracted, notably by problems of their own making. And it looks like HTS took advantage of that fact. Right now, I think what's so critical.
Right. So
Yeah, just
Blinken,
remind us what HTS is, who these players are, maybe just to give
yeah,
people a little bit more. Yeah.
yeah. So HTS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is one of these rebel groups backed by the United States and Turkey that it has been sort of corralled into Idlib province for the last few years under the de-escalation agreements that were come to. And they, just hours after the Lebanon ceasefire, burst out of Idlib and took over Aleppo, which is Syria's largest city, and certainly a very historically a very important economic hub. And this timing, why these groups have been effectively dormant for the past few years, why they would engage in this sudden offensive now is the question that people have been asking. And one answer comes from Saeed Araqat, and this is in an article that he published the other day in 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Saeed Araqat, of course, is a very well-known Palestinian journalist. He can often be seen, one of maybe two or three journalists who regularly challenge the State Department spokespersons at the State Department briefings every day. And a quick translation of his story, which is headlined, "The HTS attack on Aleppo was coordinated by the Biden administration with Turkey and Israel." And what Saeed Araqat reports is that an informed source told Al-Quds on Saturday that the attack by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, on the positions of the Syrian state and the regular army came as a result of an American-Israeli emergency plan coordinated by the administration of President Joe Biden with Turkey and, quote, was implemented according to an American vision for the second day of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon, end quote. That's where he's quoting the source. Especially in the light of the failure to achieve a decisive Israeli victory against Hezbollah, and that this is an effort to inflict a defeat on Iran and its allies in the region, such as the Syrian army that regained control of Aleppo more than 8 years ago. And his source, he describes him as someone, presumably a US official, who is involved in training the Syrian rebels, such as the Free Syrian Army, Jabhat al-Nusra, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham at bases in Jordan and Turkey at the end of the Obama administration. So that's one answer. Also, we have another interesting piece of news from Reuters, and this story, which is headlined US UAE, that's the United Arab Emirates, discussed lifting Assad sanctions in exchange for break with Iran, sources say. And it reports that the US and the United Arab Emirates have discussed with each other the possibility of lifting sanctions on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad if he peels himself away from Iran and cuts off weapons routes to Lebanon's Hezbollah, 5 people familiar with the matter said. And of course, note here that they say sanctions on President Bashar al-Assad, but actually the sanctions are not just on President Bashar al-Assad, they're on the whole Syrian economy. And they are sanctions that are calculated to cause as much suffering to the civilian population in Syria as possible, as is always the case with Western sanctions, whether they're against Iraq or Iran or against Palestinians in Gaza. That's always the goal. So you can see here the interest here is not about bringing peace and democracy and apple pie and human rights to Syria. It's about making Syria fall into line behind the US and its vassals and Israel in the region. And so, what we're learning here is that the US and its allies would be perfectly happy to see Bashar al-Assad remain in power in Syria. They don't mind him being dictatorial, just as they don't mind the UAE being very dictatorial, or Saudi Arabia or Jordan, just as long as they're in line. So that's what's at stake here. Mm-hmm. And then another story, and this is highlighted by Benjamin Norton, that we saw in the Times of Israel just in recent days. And this is of a genre. We saw these sorts of stories week after week during the height of the war in Syria, of so-called rebel commanders in Syria speaking to the Israeli media and telling them that how much the rebels are in line. And of course, when we say the rebels, we're not talking about the Syrian people or Syrians who have a sincere and genuine dislike or opposition to their government, which is the right of everyone in the world to oppose their government. We're talking about these particular US-backed groups. And in this story in the Times of Israel, they say a Syrian rebel involved in a re-energized insurgency challenging regime forces reportedly told an Israeli network that the IDF's campaign against Iran-backed forces had likely aided opposition fighters who managed to capture Aleppo and the other areas in a lightning offensive last week. And there are all sorts of quotes in this story in the Time of Israel about them saying, look, we're not against Israel. Israel is basically helping us in our cause. And so now I'll just give a couple of things of background. And I know that Asa has some things he wants to say about this too. But really, what this goes back to is that in 2011, after when we saw these popular uprisings across the Arab region, starting in Tunisia and then Egypt and country after country that threatened the existing order, and we saw protests in Syria, very quickly this was hijacked by a massive US-led CIA-run operation to turn to activate basically US-aligned rebels in Syria. And this is not this is all done out in the open. So, for example, we can take a look at this story from the New York Times from 2016. It's from January 24th, 2016, headlined, US relies heavily on Saudi money to support Syrian rebels. So, of course, Saudi Arabia being very famous for supporting democracy and self-determination and human rights across the region. And the story starts, when President Obama secretly authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to begin arming Syria's embattled rebels in 2013, the spy agency knew it would have a willing partner to help pay for the covert operation. It was the same partner the CIA has relied on for decades for money and discretion in far-off conflicts, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Since then, the CIA and its Saudi counterpart have maintained an unusual arrangement for the rebel training mission, which the Americans have codenamed Timber Sycamore. Under the deal, current and former administration officials said the Saudis contribute both weapons and large sums of money, and the CIA takes the lead in training the rebels on AK-47 assault rifles and tank-destroying missiles. And they also point out that this is another chapter in a US-Saudi alliance that goes back to the support for the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan that gave birth to what we now know as Al-Qaeda. And then another story, this is from the following year, this is from early 2017, and in this story, this is about the end of Timber Sycamore, and it says here, the end came quickly for one of the costliest covert action programs in the history of the CIA. During a White House briefing earlier last month, CIA Director Mike Pompeo recommended to President Trump that he shut down a 4-year-old effort to arm and train Syrian rebels. The president swiftly ended the program. And this is, of course, so that Trump came in and ended Barack Obama's massive $1.5 billion. They actually give the sums in the story. And what they also say in this New York Times story is that the CIA-trained fighters crossed into Syria. Once CIA-trained fighters crossed into Syria, CIA officers had difficulty controlling them. And they say that most of the weapons ended up with fighters from Nusra Front, from Nusra Front and other groups that were affiliated or are affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And finally, one other piece, this is the famous email from Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton in 2012, and this comes to us from WikiLeaks. Jake Sullivan, of course, today is the national security advisor in the Biden administration. He was working for Hillary Clinton at the time, and there you can see highlighted in this WikiLeaks email the famous sentence written by Jake Sullivan, Al-Qaeda AQ, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And of course, ending Timber Sycamore in 2017 when Trump came to power did not really end the US support for these specific groups in Syria, whose goal appears to be to take advantage of the situation in Lebanon. And according to the source spoken to by Saeed Arafat, another goal is to, of course, because Russia has a major presence in Syria, to also tie up Russia and to create more problems for Russia as the Biden administration goes out. It's really to create maximum chaos in the region. And of course, Turkey had to have, and this has also been reported in the Washington Post and New York Times in recent days, really gave the green light for the operation, because these groups, without Turkish support and logistics, would not have been able to carry out this offensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I mean, it's really despicable to see Turkey, whose leader, Erdogan, said just weeks ago, he was enforcing some sort of sanctions against Israel because of the genocide in Gaza. And then he does an about face, and, he sticks to the NATO talking points, policy memos, and comes to Israel's and the US's, aid in helping them reignite this chaos in Syria.
And I will
Yeah.
say, it's remember last week, I think it was last week or the week before, time is
Yeah.
strange now. But when we were talking about the Lebanon ceasefire and the speech that Joe Biden made announcing the Lebanon ceasefire, and we noted at the time the strange inclusion of Turkey in the list of countries that are now being named as mediators for Gaza. So he named Turkey. He said,
France.
we're making efforts along with partners, including Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. And this was the first time we had ever heard Turkey mentioned in this context, and it was very strange and very notable. And what it seems to me is that there was some kind of quid quo pro here. I'm speculating.
Yeah.
I don't have evidence for this, but I can see something where the US and Turkey have a discussion and they say, well, we want to activate these rebels, and Turkey plays a key role in that, given the effective control over Idlib and the border between Syria and Turkey, where the equipment and the weapons and so on comes in. And Turkey saying, well, we want some kind of role related to Gaza. We want to be at the table. We want to have. So you can see that there is something behind Turkey's inclusion. We don't know the full story yet, but I won't be surprised at all if it turns out to be connected to this reawakening of these US-backed groups in Syria.
Yeah. And I think, just one more thing. For people who, this is maybe new, or this is different from what people have been told in the media. What does the US and Israel and NATO, for that matter, get out of fomenting this chaos yet again in Syria? What are the Western imperialist, hegemonic goals here?
I mean, it's, again, they've said it. Syria was on the original list of countries for regime change of the neocons back in the early 2000s, that after Iraq, they were going to do Syria and they were going to do Iran. They did Libya, turning them into failed states. And the reason is that Syria has been the bridge between Iran and the resistance in Lebanon for decades. And the connection between Iran and Syria goes back many decades. During the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was backed by the West completely in order to try to destroy or weaken post-revolutionary Iran. The Gulf states all funded the Iraqi war on Iran. The weapons were transferred through Jordan. I remember seeing when I was a child, we'd go down to Aqaba. That whole road from Aqaba was just trucks and trucks and trucks coming up from Aqaba to Iraq and supplying Iraq. Jordan served the role of supplying Iraq in this Western-backed. Remember the role that France and Germany played. Germany, very famous for its use of poison gases in the most inhumane and horrifying ways, supplied Iraq with the chemical weapons that it used, or the precursors for the chemical weapons that it used against Iran. During that war, Syria stood on the side of Iran. So that, again, that gives you the length of that alliance. And this is about breaking that link between Syria and Iran, and Syria's place as a bridge between the resistance in Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah, and Iran. And of course, this, that has nothing to do with the nature of the Syrian regime. You could have an even worse Syrian regime than this one, but as long as it was allied with the United States and Israel, nobody would, the West wouldn't complain about it. They would be signing deals with it and so on. That's the important thing to understand. They don't care about Syrians. They don't care about human rights or democracy in Syria. They care about turning Syria into another country that is subservient to their interests in the region. And what that means is that if you really care about Syria or Libya or Jordan or any country in the region and want to see the people of those countries be able to express self-determination, development, to build their countries the way they want. That is never going to happen in the context of US imperialism, hegemony, regime change wars that aim to turn countries into vassals of the United States and destroy them if they refuse, because that's what has happened to country after country in the region. And if people don't see that now at this point, with everything that's out in the open, I mean, I'm not sure what else we can say.
Yeah, and the reality is that Syria provides a land bridge to supply weapons to Hezbollah. So this is about dividing the resistance axis, and the timing of the offensive on Aleppo of the armed groups' offensive against Aleppo to capture Aleppo. To me, it's not a coincidence that it's exactly aligned with the uneven ceasefire, as we've been calling it, and it's tomorrow. If you could queue up my second article first, perhaps, because I just want to re-emphasize when we have Anthony Blinken in that video at the beginning talking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Just
not condemning it in any way. I'm sorry to interrupt, Asa, but it was important that he didn't have anything negative to say about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to emphasize who they are. This is an article that we published back in 2016. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in a nutshell, is Al-Qaeda. This is one of the rebrandings of Al-Qaeda. The Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda was Jabhat al-Nusra, and it was then, this article in 2016, it was renamed to Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. That was widely sort of mocked and seen through, and then it was kind of reconfigured and rebranded again in 2017 as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. All the groups were all led by Mohammed al-Jilani, and there was a lot of talk about moderate rebels and moderate Al-Qaeda, but it's the same ideology. It's an anti-government organization. It's a you could consider it as a Islamic extremist organization. But the point is, the United States empire will use any kinds of groups as long as it serves its purposes. So we also, tomorrow, if you could go back to the first one, we also published this story in 2015, and this is about, so it wasn't just the United States aiding Al-Qaeda in Syria, it was also Israel. So there was multiple reports of the Israeli military aiding Jabhat al-Nusra, the Syrian Al-Qaeda, in the occupied sector of the Golan Heights, which is southwestern Syria, occupied by Israel for many decades. And they were using that in order to aid Al-Qaeda, in order to essentially to break up the resistance axis. It's the same purpose. And just a couple of quotes from this article. In a video report released by Vice News in December 2014, that is, in which Israeli soldiers are shown transferring wounded Syrian opposition fighters to an Israeli hospital, the narrator acknowledges that the fighters could be affiliated with al-Nusra, Syrian Al-Qaeda. Israeli media has been slightly more open about Israel's embrace of Al-Qaeda. The news website Ynet has posted footage of Israeli army medics treating wounded Syrian opposition fighters, noting it is likely that most, if not all, of these nationals are rebels from the rival jihadist Islamic State and Al-Nusra Front groups. Retired Brigadier General Michael Herzog, a former chief of staff for Israel's defense minister, told the Wall Street Journal that, quote, Nusra is a unique version of Al-Qaeda. They managed to cooperate with non-Islamist and non-jihadi organizations in one coalition. So even then, they're trying to, you have Israel kind of trying to do a PR effort on behalf of Al-Qaeda. Quote continues, they are totally focused on the war in Syria and aren't focused on us. But when Hezbollah and Iran and others are pushing south, they are very much focused on us. And later on, Ephraim Halevi, the former head of Mossad, Israeli spy agency, confirmed in an interview with Al Jazeera English that Israel had aided Al-Qaeda troops, Al-Nusra Front, by treating them in their field hospitals in the occupied Golan Heights. And although we tried to spin this as a humanitarian, the fighters were sent back. It's not as if they were it's not as if the fighters were sort of imprisoned. They were sent back to fight again in Syria, and also he clarified that there was no way that they would have done such a thing if they'd been able to capture Hezbollah fighters, which of course it doesn't seem they have been able to. And so it's an active Israeli aiding of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and that, you know, there's reason to believe that that is still ongoing, as we saw from that Times of Israel article that Ali quoted earlier on. And it was, you know, if it's worth going and reading this article after the stream, because it also gets into UN reports which detailed actual arms being sent from Israel to Al-Qaeda in Syria. So, and finally, just quickly on the final article tomorrow, more recently, this article from July last year, from before the genocide in the Gaza Strip started, a few months before, it was revealed in July last year that a former Israeli military intelligence officer, Elizabeth Surkov, prominent on social media, had been taken prisoner in Iraq, and Israeli officials denied that she was a Mossad agent. But as we covered in this article that we published in July last year, she'd certainly been an Israeli asset of some kind, at least in the past. According to her own words on her social media, she said, quote, I was in intelligence. So military intelligence, it seems to have been the Israeli military intelligence. As well as trying to incite sectarian tensions in Iraq, Elizabeth Surkov also boasted of her contacts with anti-government armed groups in Syria. Quote, as part of my research, I've maintained contacts with members of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Al-Qaeda. I've been able to affect their worldview to some extent. That's what she said.
And she also wrote the famous article in Foreign Policy, a very mainstream American publication, detailing the military assistance and financing that Israel had given to about a dozen armed groups in Syria. So she seems to have been the liaison with many of those groups. I do want to say, Asa, I mean, other than what was in that Times of Israel story, we don't know that Israel is playing an active role right now. But they may be, they may not be. But what we're also trying to do is just give people a sense of the history here. This didn't all start last week, and people need to understand the context and history to some extent.
Yeah, and for our most youngest of all viewers, who may not even know, Al-Qaeda is the group behind 9/11.
A long
And it's a
storied
group that
history of
descends, again, not to go back too far into history, that the history of the United States mobilizing politicized versions of Islam. I say versions of Islam because, of course, these are not necessarily mainstream. goes back to the 1950s when the United States saw that as a way to counter the growing support for communism and socialism across the Arab world and the decolonizing world. And so they sponsored these types of extremist groups that are not in tune with the majority of people in the region. And that, of course, continued in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the funding of the so-called Mujahideen. These were US-backed groups, and which then, as we said, morphed into Al-Qaeda, and we had what we call blowback against the United States. But these groups continue to be useful to the United States, just as other fringe groups, whether it's Nazi aligned groups in Ukraine or other parts of Europe, continue to be useful to the geopolitics of the US empire. And we have to be aware and not get played by that, and not mix this stuff up with the genuine struggles and legitimate struggles of the people of Syria and every other country for their own self-determination.
Yeah.
Just because someone is a Palestinian doesn't mean they represent all Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas and his US-backed forces don't represent the Palestinian people. They don't speak for us. They don't act on our behalf. But that doesn't mean the Palestinian people aren't engaged in a just and legitimate struggle for their rights and self-determination. So we have to be really discerning about how we talk about this topic, because, and people know that there is an effort to prevent free and open discussion of the facts around this issue, which is why I'm in a sense laboring this point.
Yeah. John, I'd love to know your thoughts. You've studied the situation in Syria, especially in the context of Western power for a long time. How are you looking at this, and what do you think is important for our listeners and viewers to know about what we're seeing now?
Well, I think, I mean, everybody was surprised. It was a shock advance, a lightning advance that I don't think people saw. I think maybe now, pretty quickly you could see the reasons why that would happen. The ceasefire froze Hezbollah, in theory, into positions that would make them unavailable to fight. It was Hezbollah primarily that defeated these groups, HTS. And in the intermediate period, HTS has attempted to, in the way they distance themselves from Al-Qaeda, to not be as sectarian as the Takfiri strains were, and attempted to professionalize governance in Idlib during that period. But the thing that's the most instructive, I think, just straight up, is that you brought up a bunch of Israeli newspaper and television reports. You can find them all over. The Israeli television has the fighters on air, and they have a military censor that we're now 14 months into covering this war in Gaza. And we know the military censor in Israel doesn't allow any kind of meaningful information to get. Like, the idea that they would have a Palestinian fighter on their television is against the law in their country. And it wasn't 20 minutes after the shock advance and they're on TV in Israel. And it's just very remarkable in these moments, when we're so immersed in this war in Gaza and things are so clear, the way the Israelis operate. And then you see this thing that would never be allowed, because the term for the censorship is about enemies. It's about the capabilities of your enemies. You're not allowed to speak about the capabilities of your enemies, or have your enemies speak about their capabilities. So they're clearly, they don't see these Syrian rebels that were defeated by Hezbollah as their enemies. And
Right.
I mean, I have a bit from Army Radio. Netanyahu convened an urgent meeting immediately after the lightning advance, and said that, first of all, this was an Army Radio story. First of all, Israel has a great interest in what is happening in Syria. From conversations I've been having in the last few hours with senior IDF officials, it appears the security system is closely following the dramatic events there. The rebels' attack on Hezbollah and Iranian militias may somewhat serve the interests of Israel. As Hezbollah and the militias are busy repelling the attack, they're not preparing to attack Israel. And so, the ability to freeze Hezbollah in their positions with this ceasefire is really what allowed that advance to move forward. Now, taking Aleppo, as being like years now, I think like 4 years they've held the hinterland in Idlib. It's essentially like a jihadist penal colony. For them to move down into Aleppo and take it it was surprising, but there didn't get much resistance. I think I'll be watching closely if the battle in Hama, if they're able to move down the highway. I think that will be more telling than their ability to capture Aleppo, because the Syrians were part of this war that Israel's been carrying out. There's been hundreds of airstrikes, as many as 1,000 airstrikes in Syria over the course of this time. They're weakened by that. Hezbollah is not in a strong position, being frozen in the ceasefire, and HTS took advantage of that. It's not clear how popular they are taking Aleppo. The media shows us that they're, the Gulf media shows us that they're liberators, but that's not entirely clear at this point, 1 week in, that's the case.
Yeah, these are the same Gulf outlets, of course, that were funding all of these, many of these groups all along as well.
Although it's notable that it's not, in the first time round, I showed that New York Times report from 2016 about how Saudi Arabia was one of the major funders. It wasn't just Saudi Arabia. That was a big one, but Qatar was involved and the UAE was involved. This time round, it seems that the Saudis and the UAE are less enthusiastic about this. Qatar still seems to be on board along with Turkey, and that's also why Al Jazeera, whose coverage, and I'm talking about Al Jazeera Arabic, their coverage on Palestine is excellent, but it becomes rather propagandistic when it comes to this issue. And the one thing I want to say is that this issue of Syria plays in directly to the efforts to sectarianize discourse in the region and to divide the region along sectarian lines, and to turn people in the region against the resistance and the axis of resistance on the basis that this is a so-called Shia axis or Shia crescent representing, the Shia stream of Islam, and to turn people against them on that basis. And so to talk about Iran as, Shia imperialism, to talk about Hezbollah as an arm of Iran, and all of this rhetoric, which was really pushed by the United States and Israel and their allies in the Gulf over the last decade or so with particular intensity, is designed to delegitimize and sap support from the resistance. And this was particularly true. There was a surge of this, for those who are old enough to remember, after Israel's defeat in Lebanon in 2006, when Hezbollah's stock rose across the region. They were seen as heroes for defeating Hezbollah, and they were seen as an Arab, Muslim, indigenous, anti-colonial resistance movement. And so there was a huge propaganda effort to rebrand Hezbollah as a sectarian Shia militia that is an arm of Iran and an enemy of the Sunni Muslims in the region. And this propaganda campaign was to a large extent successful with many people. Many people buy into this sectarian bullshit. Let's say it as it is. And so it's also not a coincidence that we see the revival of this sectarian discourse or an effort to revive it in the wake of Israel completely failing to impose its will on Lebanon. Yes, they inflicted great suffering and pain on Lebanon and its people, but they didn't break the resistance. As John has shown us week after week, they're barely able to set foot in Lebanon, and Hezbollah is strong. I mean, yes, they have said, Hassan Nasrallah in his last speech before his murder said, we suffered blows. We were willing to pay a price, but then they're not close to being broken. But this is an effort to try to isolate them politically while again breaking that link between Iran and the rest of the resistance by going after Syria again. And again, I'll say this, no one in the region is going to have their self-determination, their freedom, their ability to choose their path as their government in any country, particularly the vassals of the United States, while we have this US empire in the region. It's incompatible. Nothing is more incompatible with democracy and freedom and self-determination than the intervention of the United States.
Yeah, and the Palestinian resistance is very clear on where they stand on HTS and this lightning advance. They all spoke in unison, calling them traitors and terrorists and foreign fighters. That's the other thing that I don't know if we even mentioned that. They're the shock troops that advanced were foreign fighters. They weren't. They were predominantly foreign fighters, not Syrians. So
yeah, and remember as well, Hezbollah actually fought against these groups, for the longest time. But that's not going to be able to happen now. Hezbollah were invited into the country by the Syrian government in order to help fight against these groups, and was successful in doing that. They're not, as John has alluded to, they're not going to be doing that now. They're busy defending the border from the Israeli invasion. So they picked their moment. Absolutely.
Yeah, the timing is always important to factor in when trying to figure out the context of U.S. Israeli involvement around the region. Thank you so much.